All right, looks like we are good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. If you are on the Zoom platform watching from Zoom, please make sure to mute your microphone. We just want to make sure that we eliminate any distracting sounds besides our expert here for the Vaccine 101. So thank you for joining us. This is something, so we do speaker series every so often, and this is obviously a pressing topic right now. And usually we only open our speaker series to our members, but today we wanted to offer this to people in the public as well, because it is such a broad topic. So whether you're a member or not, thank you for being here. We look forward to disclosing this information. And since it is going to be on our Facebook Live, it will be something that you can review at a later date as well. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker here today. So just know that the format today, I'm going to introduce our speaker, and then we have a short clip to watch, and then he's going to kind of fill us in on everything vaccine related, and then I'll have some questions that we can ask that we have for him. And if you have any questions, if you are on the Zoom end of the platform, if you have questions, you can put those in the chat as we go, and we will try to answer as many as we can toward the end of his segment. If you are watching from Facebook right now, we cannot answer those live, but we will do our best to answer those after the broadcast. So without further ado, we have Dr. Daryl Nelson here today. He's the Chief Medical Officer for HCA Midwest Health System. He's board certified as a family medicine physician, and he's got more than 35 years of experience in the medical field. So we are in good company today on this subject. He graduated from the University Medical College of Kansas City Medical School, and he is the past president of Lee Summit Medical Center staff and the Missouri Academy of Family Physicians. He has led efforts of HCA Midwest Health System's 2,000 plus physicians in continuing to improve quality of care, medical staff development, and implementation of hospital-based electronic health records. So welcome today, and thank you so much for being here, Dr. Nelson. I know we have a video, but I'd love for you, if you have any introduction to this Johns Hopkins video that we're going to view, I'd love to hear from you now. So welcome.
Sure, great. Well, welcome, or thank you, and appreciate the invitation, Morgan. Delighted to be here. Currently serving as the Chief Medical Officer at CenterPoint, and as you shared, I've worked across our health system here in Kansas City for many years, and obviously I can't think of a more defining topic as far as an impact on a career than the topic we're going to talk about today. I thought just to kind of level set everyone, we play this about 1 minute infographic. Johns Hopkins University is one of the entities that has been identified as the industry leader in tracking data about our COVID pandemic. And they do a nice job updating this segment on a regular basis to kind of give a sense both across our country and internationally what's happening with the COVID pandemic. So I thought we'd start with that, and then I'd like to take a few minutes and share with the audience what our experience has been specifically with the vaccine phase of this pandemic, and then happy to take some questions. So as you can see, it's a bit of a sobering message on the one hand, but on the other hand, you noticed as some of those graphics came up that there were some clear trends downward as you watched as the information moved across the month of February as we move into March here. And I think we are cautiously optimistic and frankly almost excited as we're starting to see these declines. And for the caregivers here at CenterPoint, the institution of the vaccine program has been the light at the end of the tunnel. As you can imagine, for all of us, but certainly those of us on the front line providing care, it's been a really long and challenging year. And so finally, last December, we got the opportunity to do something that felt really proactive and potentially impactful to try to turn the tide on this pandemic. With that comes a lot of questions and understandably some anxiety about what this phase is going to be all about. And so what I thought would be helpful is to just take a few minutes and share about the development of the vaccines that we're currently using, talk a little bit about the timeline, which has been fast in terms of how vaccine development usually occurs in this country, and then some of the safeguards that have been put in place through the development phase to make sure that we're balancing the benefit of public good with the potential risk of a vaccine and a series of vaccines now that are still relatively new. So last December, as many of you are aware, the FDA created what's called an Emergency Use Authorization, or an EUA. EUAs are commonly used by the Food and Drug Administration when there is a pressing public health need to get some sort of a treatment or a therapy approved to be utilized prior to 100% completion of all of the research and the clinical studies that are typically required. Now, that said, it doesn't mean that there hasn't been substantial data submitted and reviewed to assure that there's reasonable safety. Generally speaking, when new treatments come for approval to the FDA, they've been through 3 phases of trials. And in phase 1 clinical trials, it's usually a very small number of human subjects who are tested with whatever is being utilized, whether it's a vaccine or a medication or some other sort of a therapy. And there are very tight controls around the treatment arm in that group to see if the expectations of the treatment work as expected, and more importantly, if there is harm or adverse events. If the phase 1 trial evidence is positive, then it moves on to phase 2. There's a broader group of human subjects who are then treated with the therapy or the vaccination in this case. Monitoring continues, and the FDA then assesses that information. If phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials are favorable and the benefit outweighs the risk, then there's approval to move to phase 3, which is typically in many series somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to maybe 30 or 40,000 subjects that are tested, and a light group usually tested with a comparison treatment that's actually a placebo that doesn't have active medication in it, so that the FDA and the manufacturers can determine if the treatment is creating any sort of untoward effects, and more importantly, if it's creating the therapeutic effects that are expected. And then you get to compare that with what the placebo arm shows. So once phase 3 is well along at a predefined point in its evaluation, the FDA will then take that into consideration, call the advisory group together to review the information, and then make a decision about an emergency use authorization. And that's exactly what happened for the Pfizer and the Moderna products last December. So those products had both been through many, many months of clinical phase trials and evaluations to make sure that the overall benefit outweighed the risk. Now, that doesn't mean that once that emergency use authorization is granted that it's all over. Actually, there are ongoing requirements for the manufacturers to continue reporting the experience as the vaccine moves into utilization within our communities across this country. So that data continues to be watched and looked at, and some of you may remember there was a subsequent advisory that came out about some allergic reactions that we saw with the Pfizer vaccine early on that were slightly higher than expected from the phase 1 and phase 2 and 3 trials that had occurred to that point. So I think it's important for patients and patrons to be aware that this continues to be observed very closely, obviously. In addition to these vaccines being under emergency use authorization, the technology used them is fairly new as well. And some may have heard about this messenger RNA concept, and then for this latest vaccine that just got approval over the weekend, a viral vector technology. These technologies have been well studied and are understood, but just have not been utilized in mass vaccination campaigns in our country before. So all the more reason that we need to be attentive to the ongoing data that we're seeing as we continue to move through our vaccination programs. So here at Centerpoint, the first vaccinations were given on December 22nd, and we started vaccinating our staff. And then closely behind all of our frontline staff, we started vaccinating first responders. And as many of you have heard throughout this campaign, there's been a tiered approach to help us understand where the most immediate benefit would be in getting the vaccine program launched. And so in this particular instance, the providers that are caring for patients in the hospital and those first responding in the community, along with a population of patients who are in extended care and nursing facilities, were deemed to be the most at risk and the most likely to get immediate benefit from becoming vaccinated. So we started our vaccination campaign here as the state delivered vaccine to us the week before Christmas, and have continued to work throughout that period of time in delivering vaccine and monitoring the results of the campaign. I would tell you that our firsthand experience here in giving now, as of this morning, almost 9,000 doses just on site here at Centerpoint Medical Center, have been very consistent with what we've seen in the published literature about the risk to benefit. And as I've talked to many clinicians, physicians, nurses, experts from all walks of the medical field, the majority of them have reaffirmed their belief that they believe the published data is consistent with the experience we've been having, and that the benefit to risk still looks very favorable. We have seen data that looks consistent with the side effects that have been published, and I think many are curious, if they're contemplating or anticipating becoming vaccinated, what that really looks like. And so I thought I'd share just a few numbers with all of you about what the data is shown throughout these clinical trials and has been reaffirmed by the ongoing vaccination campaigns that we're seeing, not just here at Centerpoint, but across the country. The most common side effect is actually discomfort at the injection site. These vaccines are typically given in the upper arm, as most vaccinations are, and there'll be a sensation typically hours to a day or two later that can be uncomfortable, feels like a soreness in your muscle, probably like shots you may have had previously. It's certainly manageable and tolerable. Most people don't opt to take any treatment. If there really is a high level of discomfort or uneasiness with that symptom, you can use some mild pain relievers. And while the evidence and the studies have suggested being precautionary with any medications in your body while you're taking a vaccine, there still are evidence that it's okay to use a mild pain reliever. That occurs in probably 75% of patients. So it's likely going to cause some discomfort in your upper arm when you get vaccinated, and then it generally fades away about 2 to 3 days after the vaccine. The second most common side effect is fatigue. Most people feel 12 to 18 hours after taking the vaccine, just a bit of a tiredness that's unusual for them. And that tends to linger again for about 24 to 48 hours and then tends to just fade away. That tends to occur in about a half or a little better of patients who take the vaccine. The third most common side effect is a term we use called myalgias. It's just that sensation of feeling achy or uncomfortable. Commonly flu-like is how some patients will describe it. That tends to occur in between about a third and a half of all individuals who take the vaccine. And then falling off in less common incidents after that are symptoms like headache, chills, and a low-grade fever that may be 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 cases reported after vaccination. What we have seen is typically the incidence of that series of side effects tends to be a little higher and a little more intense after the second dose. And when you understand the physiology of what's happening in your body from a vaccination, that actually makes sense to us, because the first time we expose your body, this is a novel virus, and this strain has not typically been seen in any of our bodies unless we've been infected by it. So there'll be a reasonable reaction. The second time, i.e. what we call the booster, the second dose, is given to kind of stimulate a more extended and or long-term immune reaction to the virus. And so your body's now seen this once, recognizes it, and when the booster dose is given, the reaction is typically a little more intense. And I would say that was exactly my experience. I had a sore arm the day after my vaccine, and it was gone by the second day after. My second vaccine, I had a sore arm about the same duration, but those aches and discomfort and fatigue came on me about 12 hours after the vaccination and lingered for about 24 to 30 hours and then faded away. It personally wasn't enough for me that it affected my work, but I didn't feel really well. And so to me, I knew that was good because my immune system had reacted and recognized that there was something in my body that wasn't right, and it was creating a reaction that hopefully will be remembered and sustained if or when I would become exposed to the COVID-19 virus at some future point in time. So our experience has been very consistent. I think we feel reassured that that's good news. The best news would be there's no reaction to it, I guess, as far as not feeling bad, but that usually indicates a lack of an immune system reaction. So generally, there should be some sign, at least a minimum amount of soreness or something that something has entered in your body. There's a small subset of patients who feel absolutely nothing, and that's wonderful for them. They still very likely have a good reaction. Their body just doesn't seem to process or react maybe as responsibly as other patients who get it. So I think we can reassure the audience here that we believe that this is really beneficial and that the risk of some of those side effects likely outweighs the risk of the COVID vaccine. Now, I understand that we all have seen a variety of different reactions to the actual infection, some not even knowing they have it, and others being gravely ill and unfortunately ultimately succumbing to the infection, and kind of everything in between. And I think as a longtime primary care clinician, that is what unsettles me almost more so, because even though I know what the statistics say about who should be at risk, we've treated and cared for some folks who have nominal risk factors here and were very, very ill with the COVID-19 infection. So I guess I would just want to reassure the community that we still believe that there is a significant risk with this virus, and that we have to continue to move in a direction to try to preempt its ongoing ability to infect others and try to curb the incidence and the prevalence rates, which I think you saw are starting to happen. I would say on a specific note to Centerpoint, we were well underway with our vaccines by early January, and by late January, our employee absenteeism rates had dropped into the single digits, and we were starting to see favorable trends with the severity of some of the illnesses that our providers were contracting. So we saw real life experience and data, albeit anecdotal and on a small number of folks, that was very positive here. And that further kind of enlightened our staff about this is really on the right track. This is what we need to be doing, because we had been so taxed by the continued just onslaught of this virus and the rapidly rising case rates in our community. A little bit about where the program stands as a whole. There have been almost 100 million doses now of the vaccine shipped from the federal government's supplies that are being provided by the vendors out to the jurisdictions, which are the states. And then, as I think most of you know, each state is then responsible for overseeing and conducting its vaccination program. For the state of Missouri, those allocations come from the Department of Health in Jefferson City and are delivered to vaccinators across the state. That's typically a combination of health systems like ours, public health departments, mass vaccination clinics like the National Guard has been doing in and around the state, and now moving into the retail sector where community pharmacies are able to obtain and provide the vaccination. Of those 100 million doses shipped as of yesterday morning, about 78 million of them had actually been administered to patients. And of that number, 1.3, just shy of 1.4 million have been vaccinated to Missouri residents. So the state of Missouri is picking up some good progress. We had some difficulties with the impacts of the weather a few weeks ago, and prior to that, some challenges in the distribution, which I think are being ironed out nicely now. And I think our percentage vaccine dose to patient is at about 81 or 82%. So overall, really good and positive momentum from that perspective. As far as what we anticipate from here, we need to continue to really open up avenues in which patients who want to get vaccinated can access vaccine. There's no question that there's been a mismatch between the demand and our ability to get hands-on vaccine and get it vaccinated. I'm proud to report that at Centerpoint, every dose has been delivered into a patient's arm that we received. And what you want to make sure of is that you treat that as a very precious resource and that you have a team ready to be able to provide those vaccinations once you receive them. You've heard a lot about the nuances of managing the different types of vaccine and how we have to take care of it and utilize it in a very timely fashion and then report that back to the state of Missouri. So we here at Centerpoint, I think, are doing a really strong job, as most of the vaccinators I'm hearing across the state of Missouri are managing to do. It's just continuing to keep that pipeline moving and getting vaccine out where it can be administered to patients. The big challenge for us immediately in our area here is that there is a very substantial number of patients on the list. The last I heard, somewhere around 150,000 with the Jackson County Health Department, and trying to get the folks who've signed up there aligned with these different vaccination clinics so that they can get their vaccine. And there are weekly calls, daily calls, probably weekly calls that I'm aware of that are happening as we speak, where the state of Missouri is working with the vaccinator community, all of us, to understand how we can streamline that process and become even more efficient. I listened in on a call yesterday with some experts from across the country who have been tracking the progress, and many believe that by the end of summer now, that we should be well at or beyond that 75 to 80% of the population vaccinated, which is what we believe we're going to need to try to establish a good level of immunity in conjunction with just the natural presence that the COVID vaccine has created in our population, as you so unfortunately saw in that infographic at the beginning of our presentation here. I think the other message I want to make sure everybody understands, and at least hears from me personally, is it's not time to let up yet as far as the basic tenets. We need to wash our hands. We need to continue to mask. We need to continue to socially distance. The time will come when we believe there'll be some relaxation of those recommendations, but we don't believe now is the right time. If we do that, I'm fearful that those trends that you saw on those prevalence incidences may bump back up as we see the advent of some of these variant strains of the virus that have a higher transmissibility to them. So I think it's important, as tired as we all are, to try to stay the course here for a bit longer. And one other kind of point I would use to plug my suggestion there is that influenza and respiratory syncytial virus, two common seasonal infections here in the Midwest that occur typically from December through March, have been nearly non-existent this winter. Our vaccination program for influenza wasn't any different than normal. And the only explanation that any of us can come up with is that we just have implemented a lot of standard practices, primarily hand washing and being more careful when we're ill, that we've all known were probably the right thing to do, but we probably weren't as attentive to doing that as we should have been. And I think we're all, myself included, guilty of probably slipping up on some of the things that we know just make good sense for us to keep ourselves and our loved ones healthy. So I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests we can affect the progress of this illness and infectious diseases in general. But sometimes we have to kind of face that challenge head on and really take some active steps to affect it. And we believe the vaccination, along with these other strategies and tactics that have been utilized, are clearly the right steps on a path to getting us back to somewhat more of probably what's going to be a new normal, but certainly hopefully closer to the normal many of us have known versus what we've been through over the past 12 or 13 months. So I think that's really the key points that I wanted to share during this conversation. And then I'm happy to entertain some questions and provide any resources to any of the listeners who have an interest. I have a number of selections of interest that I could happily share from the CDC and from Johns Hopkins and from some of the manufacturers about vaccine if there's an interest for any of the members to get that information and review it.
Well, thank you for that overview. I know that it is reassuring to hear some of your insight on it and just how the process works. It's also good to hear the reminder that there are some defenses that we can take that have nothing to do with the vaccine. But, you know, more specifically the vaccine, I know many people have loved ones that they want to get it or they aren't sure about whether they should get it or themselves, you know. So I know one of the bigger worries are, you know, what happens, what kind of reactions could I experience? And you kind of mentioned it's so broad, but
Yeah.
we do have one question in the chat right now. And just a reminder, if you are visiting with us via Zoom, feel free to put some questions in the chat. We're happy to read those to the doctor here. And if you are watching on Facebook Live, we will answer those afterward. We cannot see those at the moment, but one of our questions is from our guest. He's Mayor of Sugar Creek, Mike Larson, and he's asking specifically about some of the more intense, severe reactions. He's asking kind of why might you not see those as much reported in the media? You may not know the media association quite as well, but maybe just tell us a little bit more about how you do the reporting, like what is required as far
Sure.
as reaction reporting and what gets reported to the public.
Yep. So the more serious side effects that I assume he's probably alluding to, I referenced the primary one, which was a severe allergic reaction that can cause what's called anaphylaxis, which results in a nearly immediate reaction from your immune system where you develop hives, and then you can get tightness in your throat and an asthma and a breathing type syndrome that can become very severe very quickly and is really scary and unsettling. And we did see one case of that, ironically, in our very first week here in a nurse on staff who has a long history of severe allergies and asthma. And as we've been able to look back at this data, it's pretty apparent that the majority of those severe type allergic immediate reactions have been more so in people with a known history of severe allergies previously. In our case, she'd happened to have had bad reactions to dyes that had been given to her for x-ray tests in the past, and then some other allergens in the community. And being a nurse, she knew her risk, but she was frankly more fearful of COVID with her lung history than she was taking the chance, because we were able to treat her side effect. And we didn't know for sure how she'd do, but she did have a substantial reaction, and we gave her some medication to alter that reaction, and she came through okay. So we did see one of those. That incidence is reported between 3 and 11 per million doses vaccinated. It's about on that incidence. And that's the most common immediate severe reaction. There are a whole myriad of other reactions that are reported. And there was one about a neurologic condition where you get weakness on the side of your face called Bell's palsy early on. And the statisticians have backed into that and believe that the ongoing evidence, the incidence of that particular neurologic reaction is about the same in the general public as it is in those who are being vaccinated. So on any given day, Bell's palsy will occur. If you vaccinate enough folks, you're likely to, by chance, vaccinate somebody who was going to get Bell's palsy. So right now, we don't think there's a direct correlation with Bell's palsy, but those were probably two of the more serious and unsettling side effects. that have been reported, and that the incidence, while being very low, is still recognized out there. And again, it's like any other conversation when you're talking about a therapy in which there is some risk intrinsic to it. It's an overall risk to benefit. And I think our nurse said it best. She said, Dr. Nelson, I'm likely going to be one of those patients in the ICU. If I get the COVID, I need to take a chance on the vaccine. You have medicine to help me if I have a reaction. And that's how we managed it. So those are the more common severe reactions. The one I listed were the ones that are incidentally much more common and just self-limited. So I think that was probably what he was alluding to, hopefully.
Okay, and feel free, Mayor Larson, if you want to elaborate on that, let us know. But since we're talking about the reactions, can you contract COVID-19 after getting the vaccine?
Yeah, so always a good question with any vaccination. The vaccines themselves have no live virus in them. So we can't transmit COVID to you by the vaccine. There are different components of the virus that are used in unique ways to stimulate your immune system to react, but they're not actually live virus. We've used vaccinations in the past that actually had live viral components in them, but we don't currently use that technology. There have been reports of patients who get COVID concurrently, and I think it's the same statistical phenomenon that happens with Bell's palsy. When you're vaccinating this many people across a community where the prevalence was still on the rise, you're going to have folks in your clinic on the day right after they probably have been exposed, or 2 days after. You're going to vaccinate them, and a day passes and they're becoming ill, and trying to sort out, is it from my vaccine, i.e. a side effect? It's certainly not from an infection induced by it, or was I exposed to someone in around the window period of time and then became ill afterward? And that's what we believe the more common phenomenon is. There have been some press reports of post-vaccination people still getting COVID. And I think that's because no vaccine that we've ever produced that I'm aware of has a 100% efficacy rate. There will be failures where the body doesn't respond. The good news is that typically it still tends to resist the severeness of the infection if you've been previously vaccinated. And hopefully that will be the case if that were to be your situation. And we see that a lot during the flu season. Folks who've had the flu vaccine still come down with a positive flu test, but their incidence of being hospitalized or more severely ill tends to be less than in the population who's not been vaccinated. But just to reiterate, no possible way to infect anyone with the virus, because there's no component of the virus that's at all live in any of these vaccinations that are currently available for COVID-19.
Okay, so you definitely you can't transmit it to somebody else after. Oh, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. So
Okay.
what's in your system are components of like the protein or a piece of the RNA or the genetic, but not the virus itself. And so outside of a host in the body, they would not be able to be transmitted.
Okay, great. We do have another question from one of our guests here, Mary House with Cruise Planners. She is wondering how is the data being collected? Is it being collected at a person level? You know, those little cards that people get with their vaccines say that they lose it between the two, or between the first one and the booster. Is that something that like you can get another if you've lost it? Is it collected at a local level, state, federal? How's that process?
Great question. And so we encourage obviously everybody to hold on to it. It's ideal always to have your original vaccine card that shows where you were vaccinated and the log information that's on there and all the information about the very specific dose of the vaccine we gave you. But to answer the question, in the state of Missouri, all of us who vaccinate are obligated to load the information about the patient, the location where the vaccine was given, the specific information about the vial of the vaccine that was injected into the patient. And that system is called Show Me Vax. And then there is a newer iteration of that the state of Missouri just advised us this past week they're going to be launching, called Missouri Navigator. Both of these systems have the information in them. I'm not sure how easy it will be to pull that back out for community members. So I would strongly encourage them to try to hold on to that card, take a picture of it, get some way to put that in your safekeeping, because there is thought that this will maybe become like a passport, depending upon how, as we start to open communities back up, we're going to ask for documentation about whether you have immunity from having a positive COVID test or whether you have immunity from being vaccinated. So I think it's going to be important to hold on to your document. We currently can produce replicas here at Centerpoint if need be, but I'm not sure about what all the other vaccinators' capability to do that are. So we're just strongly encouraging people to hold on to that, put it somewhere where it's in very safe keeping. But your data will be entered into a mandated state tracking system. The other thing that we ask everyone to do, and we send information as all vaccinators do, is to sign up for a self-tracking tool that the CDC is working on, and they've used it with all the vaccinations that have been released in recent years. And it allows you to self-report any side effects, and then it's helped in all of that tracking that I alluded to earlier to update the information on what the incidence of side effects look like. So we encourage all of the folks who come through our clinic here to take that information home and to self-report any information. And we also advise them if they have any severe side effects to let us know back, and we have a process in which we report that up to the FDA and CDC as well.
Great, thank you. And obviously that's pretty specific to whenever someone gets the first shot and then needs to get the booster afterward. Now, what we're hearing more on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is that it's only going to require one. Is that correct? Will there be, what's the reasoning for that? Will there be expected to be a booster later on? What do you know about that?
Sure. So as you know, they just got their approval this past weekend. And at this juncture, it is recommended to be a single dose vaccine. It does not have quite the level of effectiveness that currently the Pfizer and the Moderna 2-dose vaccines are reporting. But that said, it's still significantly better than not having any protection at all. And so I think in order to try to help get us to that herd level immunity, the broader the number of vaccinations and the numbers of each of them that we can get, the better for us to safely get to that endpoint. So what we believe right now is that Pfizer and Moderna offer around 94 to 96% effectiveness 28 days after you've completed your series. So your immune system and reaction build after you've been exposed, and then you get a set level of immunity. We don't know for sure, to be candid, how long that immunity is going to last. That's a part of the ongoing clinical phase 1, 2, and 3 trials that are being monitored, as well as some monitoring that's going to be being done in the more general population after folks have been vaccinated. The Janssen product, after a single dose, is currently being reported to deliver around 80%, 80 to 85%, 28 days after. It's not quite that good 14 days after, but again, there appears to be a building level of immunity after just their single dose vaccine. But again, it certainly offers some level of response to the majority who take it should they be exposed to COVID-19. So we see efficacy with all of these vaccines, and folks commonly ask me, well, what did you take and what would you take? And to be honest, I took what was available. We happened to be getting Moderna here when we started the vaccine program in December, and I was vaccinated with Moderna like all the team was here initially. We got some Pfizer subsequently, and if we get access to Johnson & Johnson Janssen's product, we'll use that as well. But what we tell all of our folks who come through the clinic is they'll just need to keep their eyes and ears open as this continues to evolve. I think there's a reasonable likelihood that there may be boosters needed, frankly, for all of these. We've tried in the past and hoped for single doses of influenza vaccine, but we know the strain of the flu changes, and I think we're seeing some variant strains of COVID-19, which will likely, I think, result in future vaccination. But at this juncture, I don't think we know. The experts I've listened to really say we just need to stay tuned.
Great. Well, one of our next chat questions was actually about whether or not it was going to become like an annual vaccine like the flu. So it sounds like there's possibility of that, but we don't quite have a time frame yet as far as answering that. And then I do appreciate it sounds like your general message too is like, well, 85% protection is better than nothing. So whatever you can kind of get your hands on.
Yeah. And Morgan, I think you're right. I think we're just being transparent. We just don't know longer term about if there's going to be an additional need. It just stands to reason to me that within the first year of this infection, there's already 3 variants reported. That phenomenon is not unduly different than different strains of influenza as far as an analogy. And that's why we have to adjust the influenza vaccine each year. But there are some nuances that clearly are different with COVID-19. So it's not one and the same, but there are some patterns that I think might suggest there may be additional vaccines needed in the future. We'd obviously love it if not, but at this juncture, I don't think we could say for sure one way or the other.
Should you get vaccinated even if you've already gotten COVID?
Good question. And there have been a couple of different guidance recommendations come out about that. The CDC's position has typically been that you should go ahead and get vaccinated after you have fully recovered from the COVID infection. The National Institute of Health and Dr. Fauci have suggested that you give your immune system a little more time. And he happens to personally believe that 90 days after recovering from your infection may be a better time to go ahead and take the vaccine. The thought processes behind those 2 recommendations is that when you're acutely ill, your body's immune system is already taxed. And so vaccinating it during that time may alter its effectiveness and the benefit to you. And then the second issue at hand is it's hard to sort out when you're ill if any of the reactions you're having from the vaccine are related to the illness you're struggling with or not. So at a minimum, you should be fully recovered from the infection. And depending upon your comfort level and the evolving recommendations, you probably should wait some period of time. We've typically in our clinic here encouraged people to be 30 days out from their infection. And if they're willing, we've gone ahead and vaccinated. I would tell you that anecdotally, and there are starting to be some papers published about this, it does appear that the first, when you're taking a 2 vaccine regimen after already having COVID, is harder on you as far as the side effects we talked about than the second one. So I think the first dose becomes your booster dose after you've actually been infected, and the immune reaction seems to be a little more intense. And that's been the case here for our staff and physicians who had already had the infection in the past and opted to go ahead and get vaccinated. And then they reported that the second of their 2 dose wasn't quite as difficult to them. So anecdotally, for what that's worth, I think there'll be more published data on vaccinating post-COVID infected patients coming out to answer that in more detail in the future.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that I'll give the last call for anybody that's in on the Zoom call to put any questions that you might have, last minute questions that you might have in the chat. And we'll answer the Facebook Live ones at a later date if we have them. I have one more question for you as we wait for any more other questions in the chat. It's a little bit tricky, but just, it's not too bad. But I know,
like opening being live, right?
Yeah.
All right,
I know opening with that Johns Hopkins map, it feels like we were just watching it day in, day out. So it is good to see how the statistics are changing and just there is some light at the end of the tunnel. So I'd love to know, with some of the light at the end of the tunnel, how will we know when we're officially past this? Or what would you say as far as how would we know when the pandemic is officially over? How do we expect to see that?
Well, you're right. That is a very difficult question. And I follow a few epidemiologists who I've known from practicing so long across the country who are very, very much into the data and the weeds on this very question. And I just checked in with one of them last week and he said, Daryl, I hear the question, but he said, I'm just not sure we're going to know. He said, what I do know though is the reference I made earlier, which is don't let up too soon. It's going to be easy because we're all so fatigued and tired. And I don't mean don't let up in the sense of not trying to get the economy and our communities back on their feet, but we can still do that and be thoughtful and safe. But generally speaking, once you have 70% or more of a population with either natural or vaccinated immunity, you can usually declare the pandemic phase over. And so I think that's what we're all trying to look toward, is we get to a point where between vaccination and known incidence of illness, we're at 70, 75% of the population in our country there. And I think we'll be in a much better place when that comes to pass. But again, as these variant strains start to show up and other scenarios that can create resurgences, we'll have to be really careful. And obviously this has been, so devastating that there'll be much caution around a declaration around when we're there. But that's what we would scientifically look for, typically, to declare that we have it under control.
Good. Well, you answered a tricky question very well.
Okay.
So I think you did a great job with that. We don't have any more questions in the
Great.
chat. I am going to wrap it up. It sounds like you've kind of had your final words, but if you have a couple things that you want to mention, we do appreciate the partnership that we have with Centerpoint. It's really excellent to be able to partner with members on their expertise, and especially when it's something so vital and so important to not just our members, but the public in general. So we do appreciate you taking the time to do this today. And we do look forward to hearing a little bit more about it as we learn more. I see in our comments that people feel like they've learned quite a bit from just this last 45 minutes. So
Great.
I appreciate it a lot, and I'll give you the last word before we hop off here.
Yeah, well, delighted to join you. It's a privilege for us to care for our community here at Centerpoint. We pride ourselves in trying to do our best to be readily available and here when members of our community need us. We know this isn't the place most of us wake up each day and think, gosh, I hope I get to run to the hospital today. So we understand the context of needing to seek healthcare, and certainly in the midst of a pandemic. But I think I just want to reassure everybody that we really understand a lot more about how to manage in this era of the COVID-19 infection, that folks who do need care can come to the hospital or their doctor's offices and do that safely. We saw a lot of tragic stories early in this pandemic when folks were fearful about seeking care because of getting infected when they went to seek care. So I would just want to reassure everyone that it's safe. You can access us. We're here to care for you. And that it really does feel like the beginning of the light at the end of the tunnel. There is such almost a jubilation here as we get to do these clinics and to see something that's meaningfully starting to help turn the tide here. And so there's a lot of optimism. The last thing I'd want to do is just thank the chamber members and the community as a whole. There have been so many outpourings of kindness for our team here right at those times and days when you just think, can I go at it yet again? And there have been thoughts and well wishes and signs and just all sorts of random acts of kindness that we're very grateful for. So my thanks on behalf of all of our team here.
Well, great. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody that joined us today. We hope that you have a good rest of your day, and this will be viewable afterwards. So thank you.